Hello and welcome to the video. This is my video on the RunCam Split HD. Now when I first saw this I thought it was a simple SD card recorder for the Air Unit Lite for the DJI FPV system, because the Air Unit Lite, the one that's typically shipped with Cadix cameras, doesn't have an SD card to record locally, whereas the full-size Air Unit does. But now I've had it in and played with it for a little while, it's very clear that that's not what it is. It's a little bit more. It has its own camera, an ND filter, and a processor board with the SD card slot on it that actually replaces the existing DJI camera that's on your DJI FPV system in whatever model you're flying. It can record in 3 modes, from 2.7K 60 frames a second down to 1080p 60 frames a second, but it also stabilizes the recorded video too, which is something that I wasn't expecting. Now I've used the Split and RunCam hybrid cameras in a lot of my analog stuff for years, and I really like it. I'm a fan of the hybrid, especially one lens for FPV and another for the HD recording onto a SD card. I'm sure you've seen other reviews of this on other channels that focus on 2 problems. The first is there's about 30-35 milliseconds extra latency, and that varies depending on the recording setting that you're using. And when you are using the highest recording level, the 2.7K at 60 frames a second, you get a little bit of stuttering in the live FPV feed that doesn't appear on the recorded file. For pilots of fast quads, that's enough to rule out using one of these on one of their quads. Would I use this on a 5-inch quad that could carry a GoPro, full RunCam action camera, an SMO, 4K or a Peanut? No. But there are instances where this first generation of the stabilized HD recording option in such a small and lightweight package is useful. Smaller quadcopters 3 inches and below that can't handle the weight or simply don't have the room for an action camera, this would be an option. And the other one that I'd like to look at a little bit more in this video is on an airplane or a wing where there isn't room for an action camera. Newer wings like the He-Wing T1 for example, and some of the smaller wings, lots of us are now starting to put the DJI HD system in these kind of 600, 700, 800 millimeter wings, and lots of them don't have room for an action camera. And even if you do put an action camera on, it kind of destroys the aerodynamic profile of the model anyway. So I thought, as a huge wing pilot, let me stick it on a wing rather than a quad, as lots of others have done, to see how it performs and how it feels using the RunCam camera for the DJI image. Now I've installed it onto my slightly beat up AR Wing Pro to test it out. Despite the fact that this model has a huge array of options for action cameras, this just happens to be the test rig and was the easiest one to get for all the cables. I'm going to pop it on and have a go. Plus this AR Wing Pro is my first one and it's starting to get a little beat up from all the flying it's had. Now this has a full-size Air Unit with one of the original HD DJI cameras, and what I had to do was to prep everything and connect the board to the input of the Air Unit. So the way I did it, just because the cable's slightly longer from the Air Unit, I removed the cable from the back of the camera and then plugged that into the Split HD. Now as part of this I did remove the metal cover that's on the back, and it does feel like this is some form of heatsink, because when you remove it there is a pad and quite a large chip underneath. So this also started me thinking about where to place it on the model. Initially I was going to kind of hide it away and slide it behind some of the foam so you couldn't really get to it. But there is a button on here to access the QR settings. You set this thing using the RunCam app on your phone, you set the settings you want, and then you can show it a QR code and that will change all the settings for you. And there is a button here to stop and start recording if you haven't got auto recording set. So that means that I needed it ideally with a little bit of airflow because I didn't know how hot it was going to get, but also access to that button and of course access to the SD card to get the files afterwards as well. So that meant it ended up like this. So I popped the camera in the camera slot that wasn't used before and then cut a channel, because by this point I'd actually already connected all the cables and it's not a simple case of, a quick unplug and plug for the DJI system. It's quite involved to make the connection again. And then I put the Split HD in the nose and then connected it up to the air unit. Did put a bit of strain relief in this. These cables aren't really designed to be abused, so do be careful when you are installing stuff. It would have been nice to have slightly longer cables or other options for this unit, because it does mean at the moment that it has to be pretty close to the air unit. And I think for those things like a quad where you're mounting it underneath, that makes a lot of sense. But in a wing, potentially you're going to have a little bit more room to play with. Now, the only other thing I needed to do was to supply a clean 5-volt power supply for this thing. I think on the specs it says about 560 milliamps, but I used one of these, a Matex Systems Micro BEC. This will provide 5 volts at 1.5 amps, and I connected it to the spare ESC port on my flight controller, and that then actually powered the unit. So then it was just a case of going out to the field and getting some flying done, and that's what I've been doing. And I thought what I'd do is I'd try and synchronize the DJI goggle DVR footage on the left hand side with the RunCam Split HD footage on the right hand side. Now, I am recording in 1080p on the RunCam Split, just because that actually works for me as a nicer file size, and also it means that you don't get that stuttering. And you can see here that the stabilization is actually very gentle, but the image is really nice. It's actually working okay. What it's doing is smoothing out some of the micro movements rather than some of the big stuff that some of the cameras from other vendors are doing. So after testing this in the fixed wing, the downsides are not what you'd expect. The thing that has been the biggest issue for me is that I can't change the scene type from the goggles or the FPV remote like you can with the DJI camera and things like the Nebula Pros. Even flying in a spirited way, I can't feel that extra latency, so I don't think that's as much of an issue if you're going to be in fixed wing land. This could be a good option for builds of smaller HD wings and twins that are coming out at the moment, where adding an action camera just isn't an option. I would avoid the 2.7K mode unless you can live with the increased latency and the repeated frames in the live FPV feed. The extra latency does mean it could limit the use cases, but I know that RunCam are going to be working on this. They're definitely aware of all of the feedback. I'll be keeping an eye out for a HD hybrid or a RunCam micro action camera with stabilization. I'm excited to see that RunCam are starting to use stabilization on something like this, as it could point to RunCam action camera in the near future that includes it too. A competitor for something like the Peanut would be great. RunCam do understand the hobby more than most, and having a super lightweight camera that had stabilization, maybe didn't have a battery, would be super small and lightweight, would be really welcome. In summary, this is a great way to get stabilized recordings from your DJI HD wing or similar without adding tons of weight and drag with a traditional action camera. I just wish it worked in parallel with the DJI HD camera system rather than in series, and gave us those couple of issues. Thank you for spending your time today watching that video. You can find me in all the usual places on social media, and if you're trying to learn about a subject, then check out the playlist. All of my videos are organized into easy to follow playlists that, if you're trying to learn a topic, will take you from the basics right the way through to some pretty advanced stuff.